Sherman Garden education team. And first thing I want to tell everybody is we are recording this presentation, and we're doing so that we can send the video out and make it available for viewing later. So everyone should get a link later on so that they can rewatch it, or people who aren't here tonight can watch it at their leisure. So wanted to let everybody know that. Also, we have from the education team, Colleen Haas, Marcia Keenan, Sherry Goal. We do have an intern, Valerie Johnson, but I don't see her on tonight. We also have Marty Yoakum and Mary Malloy, who are a part of the community garden as well. And lastly, questions. If you have any questions during the presentation, we welcome those. But we will probably answer those at the end. If you want to enter one in the chat box so that you don't forget it, or you don't feel comfortable asking in person, please feel free to do so, and I'll read those out at the end and have those answered as well. So, I will turn things over to Colleen, who is going to start our presentation.
Thank you, Kelly, and welcome everybody to our second video, Zoom, whatever we call it, question and answer, planting a spring garden presentation. This is our second one for the 2024 season. So we're happy to have everyone along with us. We're going to get started right off from the beginning. I want to read this quote to you because to me it was really beautiful. It says, "The garden requires patient labor and attention. Plants do not grow merely to satisfy ambitions or to fulfill good intentions. They thrive because someone expended effort on them." And we as gardeners are the ones who expend the effort on our plants and our gardens. And so today we wanted to give you some tips on how you can grow some early plants, cool season vegetables in the garden early in spring, and give you some ideas of what plants grow well at this time. And then also when it's good to grow them, and you know, a little bit of help with getting started in a spring garden. So with that, we'll move on. So my first question to you and to myself would be, why do we want to plant a spring garden? What would be the purpose of going out there in the cold weather and expending effort on plants? And one of the things is that cool season vegetables, which are the ones that we can grow at this time of year in the early spring, are typically low maintenance and easy to grow vegetables. And also, they are the vegetables that are the tastiest in the springtime. And we need to remember spring goes all the way till the middle of June, and most of these vegetables will be harvested by that time. And so during those cooler days, they are the tastiest. Another reason to plant a spring garden is you can harvest these cool season vegetables by the time you're ready to plant summer crops, like tomatoes or peppers and things that are warm season vegetables. So it allows you to increase your capacity for your garden. A lot of us, when we get out there, we find that a 4x8 raised bed garden is not very big once we get out there and start growing. And so being able to increase our capacity to grow more vegetables becomes important. And the final thing, which is my favorite thing, is that you enjoy some of the season's first produce from your own garden. And it's not something that you have to wait for and buy in the grocery stores. So it makes it a fun thing to grow a spring garden. Of course, we have to plan ahead, and planning is always important in planting a garden. So I would tell you to always consider what you and your family like and will eat, rather than growing things that you aren't going to eat, or that just to give it away or something is fine, but at the same time, you really want to be able to grow things that you like. Secondly, be realistic about your time commitment to your garden. You know, are you ready to brave those elements of spring gardening where you possibly will have to haul your own water, or dealing with the colder weather and winds out at Sherman Garden, or needing to reschedule your time in the garden because the weather isn't cooperating? So you have to change when you're going to go out there. And sometimes that can really make it hard to garden in the spring. Just a note about hauling your own water. That is a possibility at Sherman. We have been notified that the water will be turned on, we hope, by April 1st. That's no guarantee, but we do hope that that will happen. But if you do decide to plant before that time, then you will need to be hauling your own water out there, which means a couple of gallons of water to take out there when you plant so that you can water things from the very beginning. A final note on that is we will typically get that information on when the water is turned on. And then we will get that information in an email to all the gardeners as soon as we know. So the first thing that we need to do when we are heading out to the garden, before we even think about planting, is preparing the soil. So the first thing that you're going to want to do, especially at Sherman, is to add compost to your soil when it's dry enough to work. We do have compost that will be out there available for you to use. It is all set to go. So being that today is the first day the garden is open, there is compost out there in the compost bin. In the system, there are 5 or 4 compost bins, and there is compost, ready to use compost, in the final bin, which is bin number 9, the one furthest to the east from the walking path as you come up. And you are welcome to add some compost to your garden and work it in. There are buckets there to carry it to your garden with. So that is available for your use when you go out to the garden. Of course, putting the compost in your garden is best to do when that soil is dry enough to work. And the best way to do that is to check your soil using what we call the squeeze test. And we do have a sheet about this, which you will be sent to you later. But the squeeze test is simply grabbing a handful of soil about 3 inches down and firmly squeezing your hand with that soil in it. And if you have anything oozing out between your fingers, you know that that soil is way too wet to work. So you can't work in the soil at that time. Then you open your hand and you should have a clump of soil in your hand. And if you poke at it and it falls apart, then that soil is dry enough to work. If it doesn't fall apart, it probably needs to dry just a little bit more, and you might need to wait another day or 2 before you plant. So once you are able to work that soil, then using a fork or a shovel to turn in the compost to a depth of about 4 inches is good. You don't want to overwork the soil. You just combine it only until your particles are pea to marble sized. And then you rake it to level it out and break up any of the large clumps that are left. And then you're ready to plant. It's really pretty simple. But, after you plant, be sure you water right away so that you help those little seeds and those plants to settle in and those seeds to germinate. And then mulch, so that you help retain the moisture, and then you don't have to water as much. Next, we need to talk about what are the vegetables that we can plant at this time of the season. Those are all called cool season vegetables. Typically, they're vegetables that grow better during those cool spring days, and they don't mind the chill at night. They'll germinate in the cool soil. Plants like tomatoes and peppers and eggplant and green beans, those kind of things, squash, they will not germinate in cool soil. So that's why those are not vegetables that you're going to plant at this time. Cool season vegetables typically do not do well in the heat of those summer months. They will go to flower or seed when that heat hits, and they typically develop an unpleasant taste or a texture once that weather warms. That's not very, not very pleasant to the taste. So cool season vegetables have there are two groups of those, and they're grouped by their hardiness. There are hardy cool season vegetables, and then there are what they call half hardy or frost tolerant vegetables. So the hardy vegetables are the ones that can be planted 4 to 6 weeks before the average frost-free date. So they also can be planted as soon as you can work the soil. In our region, this is typically early March to early April. And the plants on that list are arugula, broccoli, Brussels sprouts, cabbage, kale, kohlrabi, leeks, onions, peas, rutabaga, spinach, and turnip. So those vegetables can be planted pretty soon, within the next, week at least. Because we're going to talk a little bit about when the average frost-free date typically falls. So once we talk about the hardy vegetables, then we have the half-hardy or those frost-tolerant vegetables. And typically those can be planted 2 to 3 weeks before that average frost-free date. They do need a soil temperature above 40 degrees for their seeds to germinate. And most likely 2 to 3 weeks before that average frost-free date is when your soil is going to be above 40 degrees. So in our region, this is a late March to a late April dates. Most of these plants can also be planted again in mid-July to early September, and you can get another harvest, or what we call a fall harvest, out of those. The only ones you don't want to do that with are potatoes or parsnips, because they're best when they're planted in spring only. And the vegetables on that list are your beets, carrots, cauliflower, leaf lettuce, mustard greens, parsnips, potatoes, radishes, and Swiss chard. Okay, now we need to talk about those frost-free dates. We need to know when that planting date for each of these groups, so that we know when we're gonna plant. So in Illinois, well, anywhere, frost-free dates are averages, and the actual date of the last frost can vary from year to year. So they have a median time or median dates for when that last 32-degree freeze has occurred for Northern Illinois. And it is normally between April 8th and April 29th. So April 22nd is considered that median date. So when you count backwards your weeks, you would typically count it from that April 22nd date. So for those hardy vegetables, which can be planted the 4 to 6 weeks before the average frost-free date, if you count back 4 to 6 weeks, 4 weeks would be being able to plant them around March 22nd to the 31st. I typically will count back the 4 weeks, just because I don't want to put them in too soon. For half-hardy vegetables, the ones that can be planted 2 to 3 weeks before an average frost-free date, then they can be planted between April 1st and the 8th. So, that's really the biggest information that we need to know. We now know that, what do we need to do to prepare our gardens for planting? And thinking about what kind of vegetables we want to plant. We know how we need to prepare the soil, and what are the vegetables we can plant and when we can plant them. I'd like to take some time with the next few slides just to give you some tips on planting some of the most common cool season vegetables that we may want to put in our gardens, especially out at Sherman. So I have some slides with some tips for growing some of the different crops. So some tips for growing root crops. Your root crops are going to be things like beets and carrots and radishes, and they fall into that frost tolerant or the half-hardy group, the ones that can be planted 2 to 3 weeks before the average frost-free date. So those are the ones that can be planted around April 1st and after that. So most of these root crops are best planted by direct sowing from seed. So those would be the ones you would go to the store and buy the seeds for. Things like carrots and, excuse me, radishes and beets. They need real well-drained soil and plenty of organic matter. Organic matter means your compost. And so composting your soil is going to be really helpful for those root crops. A lot of the root crop seeds are very small seeds, especially things like lettuce, radishes, and carrots. And so the best way really to plant those is to just make a shallow trench in a row, and then spread a pinch of the seed along the row. And cover it over, water it in, let them germinate and start to grow. And then once those seedlings are 1 to 2 inches tall, then you thin them to the correct spacing. Typical spacing is 2 to 3 inches. But as my last note there is to always read your seed packet for further tips, because it will give you all of that information. It will tell you how deep to plant the seeds, so you'd know how deep to make your little trench. It'll tell you how far to correctly thin them for the correct spacing. It'll give you information about approximate germination time. So never throw your seed packets away until you actually have your plant growing. And sometimes I don't even do it then. I just keep them in my little bag I carry out to my garden with me, so that I can always refer to it if I need to. Some tips for growing brassica crops. The brassicas are your broccoli, cabbage, your kale, your Brussels sprouts, arugula. Most of these fall into the hardy group. So they're the plants that you can plant 4 to 6 weeks before that April 22nd average frost-free date. So they can be planted as soon as tomorrow if you wanted, or the 22nd of March. But these plants do grow best as transplants because they mature pretty quickly. I believe I've seen broccoli and Brussels sprouts and kale and arugula out in the stores already to purchase. So they can be planted anytime going forward. Again, always follow your plant tag instructions for spacing. It's easy to space them too close together in a 4x8 raised bed, because they start out small but they get big. And one of the biggest things you want to do is make sure you're leaving enough room for those roots to really take hold and produce a good plant. And the more crowded they are, the smaller plant and the less harvest that you're going to get from the plant. So we always try and make sure that you pay attention to spacing. And harvesting with brassica crops, the timing is essential for your harvest. They easily become over mature, and at that time they're not as tasty. Arugula is a really fast growing crop, and it will easily become bitter. Broccoli, once you get your heads of broccoli, they easily go to flower, and you get the little yellow flowers on it. And at that time, they're over mature and not very tasty either. So brassicas are crops you really want to watch closely, and be sure that you're on top of that as far as harvesting go, because they're going to be ready to harvest pretty quickly. And your plant tag should give you some information on that too, as far as your spacing and your time till your ability to harvest. Some tips on growing leafy green vegetables. That would include your lettuces, your mustard greens, your Swiss chard. Most of these are also in the frost tolerant group. So they're going to be the ones that are 2 to 3 weeks before that average frost-free date. So ones that you can plant by around April 1st if you want. Again, leafy greens are best if they're direct sowed from seed. It's the easiest. They're plants that you could consider succession planting with, because it gives you a more usable harvest. Succession planting is simply a way to vary your harvest. Typically it'd be something like planting a row of lettuce on April 1st and then waiting a week and planting another row of lettuce, a week later.
Oh,
And
yeah.
then planting another row of lettuce a week later. So that way you vary that harvest. Typically these are things, vegetables you want to use pretty quickly, and they don't store necessarily really well in the refrigerator. I mean, they can, and there are ways to make them last a little bit longer, but being able to harvest a row of lettuce and use that, and then in another week you're going to have another row of lettuce to harvest, and you can use that. So that works really well with a lot of the leafy greens. They're pretty fast maturing, and it's best to harvest them when they're really young and tender. I typically will harvest the whole lettuce plant at one time. I like to do that. It seems to work really well for me, rather than just harvesting the outer leaves. And I just pull it out of the ground to shake off the dirt, rinse it off, and put them in a glass of water and put them in my refrigerator. And that has worked really well for me for harvesting lettuce especially. I don't really grow too many greens, so I haven't done that with greens, but maybe somebody else could share about that later. Again, always keep your seed packets for further tips. They'll give you, again, ideas on germination time and how deep to plant your seeds. And also, your typical time from planting to harvest. So those are always helpful things to have, at your fingertips when you're out there at your garden. So some tips for growing garden peas. I love to grow peas, and I've had some real success with them. And one of the things that's really helpful with growing garden peas, they are a hardy, in the hardy group, and so they can be planted soon. They can be grown throughout Illinois, which is really nice. They do need soil temps of at least 45 degrees for the seeds to germinate. And the soil needs to be dry enough, you know, you don't want it sticking to your garden tools and clumping up. So, the one thing about peas is they can be very easily injured by direct contact with fertilizers. So it's really good to, you know, be careful with the amount of compost that you have around them. It can kind of burn the seed a little bit. I've never really had a problem with that, but you know, I still mix in just a small amount of compost into the soil. So and your plants are going to be much more productive if you do grow your peas on some kind of a pole or fence or trellis. That's easier to pick them also. Early plantings, because they like that spring cool time, are generally going to produce a larger yield than your later plantings. So, and you will find if you plant them a little bit later, even, you know, beginning of June, the plants are going to start to typically die out. And they produce from the bottom up. So we'll talk about that in a little bit with harvesting, but they want that soil cool, so the mulching can really help with that. Along with reducing your moisture loss and keeping down any kind of soil-borne pathogens, which are simply diseases that are in the soil. There are soil-borne diseases that are there. So mulch can tend to keep that down, and it doesn't splash up onto your plants when you're watering or even when the rains come. As far as harvesting peas, the pods on the lower part of the plant are going to mature the earliest. And they're the kind of plant that you'll be out there one day and you only have so many, and then you'll go out the next day and you have a whole lot more to harvest. Beans are that way too. So it's a good thing to plan on harvesting about every other day so that you ensure that you get them before they become hard and starchy and not very tasty any longer. The one thing with the rather regular green pod peas, even if whether they're edible pods or not edible pods, they deteriorate pretty quickly after picking. So you do want to use them pretty quickly, as opposed to snow peas, which are the flat pod peas. They are easily stored and kept refrigerated, and they will stay good for a pretty long time. As far as growing onions, onions are a hardy vegetable also, so they can be planted soon here. You know, it's the 4 to 6 weeks, so anytime the end of March. They are typically grown from either sets, transplants, or seeds. And you can plant them as soon as the soil is workable. So again, late March to early April. Now, onions start their bulb formation when they have a day length that is a proper duration. And there's different varieties that require different day lengths to initiate their bulbing. There are basically 3 kinds of onions. There are long day onions, short day onions, and then what they call day neutral onions. And it all is the number of hours of daylight that is available to them and how they're able to grow. In Illinois, you want to look for long day onion varieties. These varieties will allow the top of the onion to get really long and lush prior to bulbing. This is all new to me. I knew nothing about this until I started doing some research here. And one of our fellow gardeners gave me a bunch of information about this. So I'm really excited about all of this. I didn't know that there were these 3 types of onions. So this is just really cool. You can also grow day neutral onions in Illinois. They will do fine. The one variety that I have found that I know are day neutral onions are called candy onions, and you can buy them in sets. The long day onions, I believe, are Walla Walla. That's the only one that I know of at this time. And those I think you can buy in sets too. I have not seen those this year yet. But there's also a white, the Spanish onions, the white or the yellow Spanish onions are a long day onion too, so which is good for growing here in Illinois. Onions need good fertile soil also. They need adequate soil moisture, and they do love the cool temperatures. They also have very shallow roots, and they don't compete well with weeds and grasses. And so keeping your gardens weed free is really, really helpful to onions. You don't want them to be overpowered by the weeds. So if you want to grow transplants are the best for producing your large dry onions that you may want to cure and then keep over the winter. However, they are usually sold in bundles of about 60 to 80, and they cost a lot more. You can buy them that way, and if split it between some fellow gardeners if you like, and they do grow well. Seeds are probably the least popular method to grow due to the fact that it's going to take longer for them to develop. However, you can find more varieties in seeds than you can in transplants or in sets. I typically grow sets because it's the easiest. And when you grow sets, you can get both green and dry onions from sets if you divide them out into size. And I'll talk about that a little bit later. But they're typically sold by color. In the stores, you typically will find yellow, white, and red as far as the sets. You can purchase them fairly early on. I've already purchased mine, and you just need to make sure you store them in a cool, dark, dry environment until you want to plant them. So if you are at the point where you want to plant the onions with sets, the first thing to do is to divide them into two sizes. The large sets would be ones that are larger than a dime. And those can become your green onions. And the smaller sets that are smaller than a dime are what you would use for your onions you're going to dry. Now, when you're planting for the green onions, this is exciting too, I think, because I haven't done this before. You would plant your larger sets 1.5 inches deep, and you'd plant them close enough so that they're touching each other. And then when they reach about 4 inches tall, you slightly hill the row. You use a hoe and you just pull the loose soil up around them all along down the row on both sides, so that it helps them to develop that nice long white stem that becomes the green onion. And then they don't bulb out as much. But if you're planting for dry onions, then you want to plant those smaller sets and plant them about 1 inch deep and 2 to 4 inches apart. And then we would just grow your onions there that way. So basically, that's all I have to share with you tonight. But we do have some additional information on some documents. And those documents are listed on this slide. And our plan is that once this recording of this presentation is ready to go, we will be sending out these documents to you, along with a few other ones about early planting and just good practice in your gardens. We will be sending those out to you by Monday, May 20 or March 25th. So that you will have that information. You will also have the ability to link in to this presentation that's been recorded. And we'll also be able to send some new gardener information for the Q&A on April 3rd. So we'll be sending that all out to you in just a few days. So,
Thanks, Colleen. I need to give I appreciate all of this information. Thank you for all of it. I am so excited now to get out to the garden. I want to remind everybody that the garden did open today. So you're welcome to get out there and start planting all of your early vegetables and get going on it. And for starting on questions, we do have one in the chat box from Heidi. Do these vegetables need the bees to pollinate? And do you recommend also planting flowers along with these vegetables?
Well, I always like to plant flowers along with my vegetables because I think it helps with the pollination. And yes, most, I correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe the root crops do not need bees for pollination. And bees are not the only things that pollinate. There are other pollinators out there too. Most brassicas need the bees for pollination. I don't think onions do either. Correct me if I'm wrong, anybody who's on here. If you can help with that.
I don't think they do either, but and then planting flowers, some of the flowers you plant help with, there are a few deer or rabbits that like to feed in the area. So maybe some of those might be a deterrent as well in that way. If you planted some marigolds or some other flowers in your garden along the edges.
Right.
I see that often.
There's a nice article from Michigan State University about what varieties need, and you're correct that the root vegetables, brassicas, legumes, tubers do not require bees to pollinate. But we can send that that article out from Michigan State.
Okay.
Sounds good.
Hi, Colleen. May I add just one thing? I'm sorry, my cat, of course, the one time I turn my camera on, he jumps up here. If I may just add that it is my understanding that, and I don't know exactly which ones, but some of the cool season crops are biennials. And so that if they go into their second season, that they would then require some sort of pollination, whether that, I'm not sure if that's self or insect pollination or wind. And then I know that onions, some of them are also biennials also. So, and I do see a lot of bees hanging out on my my onions, like when they form the bloom at the top, they will then if I allow them to flower, then they do attract a lot of bees. But whether or not that's required, I don't know. But that's just something to consider, whether it's an annual or biannual, if you want it to seed.
Thanks, Patsy.
I didn't know that either.
Are the bees around this time of year? I mean, are there enough bees around during this spring season to do their job?
I have seen honeybees out there looking for food already. There are some early pollinators, depending on which insects those might be. Currently, I cannot recall, but there are some out there.
Okay, thanks.
Sure.
Patsy, did our bees make it from last year?
They did not.
Oh, okay.
This is Carol Lusky. I'm a beekeeper, and at 55 degrees is when the bees will come out. So they like to come out and fly around. If it gets cold again, they go back in till it gets warm again.
Really?
Yep.
And when they come out, are they looking for food? Or are they
Oh,
just,
Oh yeah, no, they come out looking for food because they've probably used up all their stores. If they, if they've haven't been fed by the beekeeper, they've used up their stores, and they go out and they get the pollens off the trees, off anything they can get pollen off of. They will go to. So
okay,
early flowers are good.
yeah.
Do we have more questions for Colleen?
As Kelly had said earlier, the flowers are also good as deterrents for different diseases and even insects too. Some insect pests can keep them away. So you'll hear a lot of people talk about marigolds with your tomatoes and basil with the tomatoes. Basil is its smell is rather pungent. So any of those things a lot of the herbs can be very helpful too in the garden to keep away different pests, whether it's wildlife or insects that are more pests too. So
Will those herbs grow during this spring season? Or are they summer?
there's a lot of them that are perennials. So those will winter over and come back. Those we typically don't plant out there because of the fact that, you may not have the same garden the next year. So most of the typical ones that people like to plant, at least out at Sherman, like cilantro and basil, those are definitely a summer herb, one that you want to plant when you're planting your summer crops.
Okay.
So, but things like thyme and rosemary, marjoram, those you could plant at this time. It's also possible that if you want to plant them, you can plant them and then dig them up and bring them in the house for the winter and put them back out there in the next year. So it's also something you can do. So we do allow chives out there though. But they would stay with the garden. So chives are something that's a perennial and they come back. So
There is a comment in the chat box from Marcia. She says, wouldn't you want to plant your flowers later in the season since they would not be cool season plants?
yes, I would plant them a little bit later. But most of those flowers you could probably plant by middle April. Things that you want to go in the garden, like marigolds, are pretty hardy. I've planted them as early as like April 15th or so. Snapdragons are a cool one. They do fine that early. Those are two that I know of, that I can think of that would do fine earlier on.
Does anyone have any more questions for Colleen?
I was just gonna jump in, Kelly, and say I love all this discussion about talking about the pollinators because that's so important. Such a conversation. That's what's so nice about Sherman being in the midst of a prairie. That prairie's waking up and is going to supply food for bees and insects and other pollinators like soldier beetles. I mean, that whole prairie is alive and our gardens just adds to that. But that's one neat thing about being in the midst of a restored prairie. We have lots of things blooming, not just what's going on in our garden beds.
That's a good point. Thank you for that, Marcia. Yeah.
And Colleen, this is Sherry. Pansies are a good source of early spring flower for pollinators. They're pretty cold hardy and the pollinators like them too.
Yeah. They wouldn't be something that's gonna last very long out there.
Right.
So once it gets warm out there, there's something that are gonna either die out or you can get them somewhere where there's a little more shade, and then you can get them to last a little longer. But because they're an annual flower, they only have a certain lifespan. Especially in the Illinois and in the northern area. So. But they sure would be pretty.
They're pretty in the early spring, you're right, but boy, summer comes
Yeah.
along.
Yeah.
Anyone else? You must have been very, very thorough, Colleen. I know you were, but
Well, I hope so. And I hope I didn't go too fast. If I did, I can go back to some slides if you'd like any information, more information. Be happy
Colleen,
to.
I just want to say, I really enjoyed what you shared tonight. It was so much that I'm really looking forward to receiving the information and being able to kind of walk through it. Because it just takes me longer to kind of integrate all of that. But it just was so helpful. Thank you.
Good. I'm glad that we could record it and we can send it out to you. So then, great. That
Thank
just,
you very much. Thank you so much. Really good information. I'm looking forward to learning more from everyone.
Yeah, same here.
well, thank you.
Thank
It-
you very
It was
much.
fun. I learned a lot, even putting some of this together. As I said, learned all about
Just talk.
long day, short day, and day neutral onions. I knew nothing about this before. So I'm excited about that. So fun stuff. At least for me.
Now we can say thank you.